He wasn't afraid of ghosts. He was afraid of what silence was hiding. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Somewhere quiet, I hope, because this story begins in a place where even the wind seems to hold its breath. The road to Blackridge Hollow stretched for miles without a single streetlight, just a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through dense Oregon pine, the kind that swallowed sound and bent the air with the scent of damp earth and resin. Ethan Cole drove slowly, his old pickup rumbling like it had something to say, but didn't know how to finish the sentence. Beside him, Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, a German shepherd with a sable coat dark as shadow and eyes that caught what little light there was, steady and watchful, like a soldier who never quite clocked out. Ethan hadn't spoken in over 20 minutes, not since the last gas station faded into the rearview mirror, not since the old man behind the counter gave him that look, the kind that lingers too long when you mention where you're headed. That cabin, the man had muttered, slow, cautious, ain't worth $500, not even if they paid you to take it. Ethan didn't answer then, and he didn't answer now, because $500 was all he had left, folded in a worn envelope that once held something more, plans, maybe, or a future he no longer recognized. The tires crunched over gravel as he turned off the main road, headlights slicing through a wall of trees that seemed to lean inward, as if watching. The cabin revealed itself slowly, piece by piece, like it didn't want to be seen all at once. First the outline of the roof, sagging slightly under years of neglect. Then the porch, its wooden planks warped and uneven, one corner dipped like a tired shoulder. And finally the windows, dark, hollow rectangles that reflected nothing back. Ethan killed the engine. Silence didn't follow. It arrived. Heavy. Immediate. Like it had been waiting. The ticking of the cooling engine echoed too loudly, then faded, leaving only the faint whisper of wind brushing through pine needles high above, a sound that felt distant, disconnected from the ground beneath his boots as he stepped out. The air was colder here than it should have been for early fall, carrying a sharpness that slipped through fabric and settled in the bones. Rex jumped down beside him without a sound, paws landing soft against the gravel, head low, ears forward. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just stood there, staring at the cabin like it had just said something only he could hear. Ethan followed his gaze. It's just a place, he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. His voice sounded different out here, smaller somehow, like the trees were absorbing it before it could travel. He reached into the truck, grabbed his duffel bag, then hesitated for half a second, hand resting on the door. In another life, hesitation meant danger. It meant something wasn't right. Tonight, it meant nothing. Or at least that's what he told himself. The porch creaked under his weight as he climbed the steps, each board complaining softly, a slow, tired sound that echoed beneath him. The front door was unlocked. Of course it was. Places like this didn't need locks. They relied on something else to keep people out. He pushed it open, and the hinges let out a long, low groan, like the cabin was waking up. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, something that didn't belong but refused to leave. Moonlight slipped through the windows in thin, pale strips, just enough to outline the shapes of forgotten furniture. An overturned chair, a table with one leg shorter than the others, a fireplace blackened with age. Rex stepped in ahead of him, slow, deliberate, nose low, scanning. His body didn't tense the way it did in danger. It sharpened, focused, like he was listening. Ethan dropped the bag near the wall, boots thudding softly against the warped floorboards. Not haunted, he said under his breath, almost convincing himself. Just old. But the moment the words left his mouth, something answered. Not loud, not dramatic, just a soft, hollow tap, somewhere deeper in the cabin. Rex froze. His ears twitched once, then again, and in that stillness, Ethan realized something that settled deeper than fear ever could. This place wasn't empty. It was waiting. The sound did not come again right away, and somehow that made it worse, as if whatever had made it was waiting for him to notice before deciding whether to continue. Ethan stood still, listening harder than he had in years, the way he used to in places where silence was never truly empty, where the smallest shift in sound could mean everything. Rex moved first, one slow step across the warped floor, then another, his nails barely making a whisper as he traced an invisible line through the room. His nose hovered inches above the wood, pausing, adjusting, recalibrating as though the air itself carried a memory he was trying to read. Ethan exhaled quietly and forced his shoulders to loosen, though the tension did not leave. It just settled deeper, coiling somewhere behind his ribs. "Old houses make noise," he said, the words thin and unconvincing even to him. "Wood expands. Contracts. That is all this is." But Rex did not look back, did not acknowledge him at all, and that silence between them felt heavier than any answer. The dog moved toward the far side of the room where the moonlight did not quite reach, where the shadows gathered thicker, almost layered, like something had been placed there and then forgotten. Ethan followed, slower, his boots pressing into the floorboards with a low creak that seemed too loud for the space. The air shifted as he stepped deeper inside, carrying that faint metallic scent again, sharper now, mixed with something older, something closed off. He noticed then that the temperature dipped in that corner, not dramatically, but enough to feel it along the back of his neck, a subtle difference that made the skin there tighten. Rex stopped near the base of the far wall and lowered himself slightly, not in fear, but in focus, his ears angling forward, then back, then forward again as if catching fragments of something just beyond reach. Ethan crouched beside him, his hand hovering for a second before resting lightly against the dog's shoulder, feeling the steady warmth beneath the thick coat, the quiet rhythm of breath that grounded him more than anything else in that moment. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, softer now, less certain. Rex did not respond with a bark or a whine. He simply shifted his weight and pressed his nose closer to the wall, then tapped it once with the side of his muzzle, a small, deliberate motion. Ethan frowned. The wall looked like the rest of the cabin, aged wood panels, uneven in places, stained by time and weather. Nothing stood out, nothing obvious. And yet, the dog did not move away. Instead, Rex took a step back, then forward again, repeating the motion, mapping the space with quiet insistence. Ethan watched him, a memory rising uninvited, the kind that came without warning and settled in before you could push it away. There had been a day, years ago, in a place far from here, where Rex had done something similar, pacing a narrow strip of ground, while everyone else saw nothing but dust and debris. Ethan had trusted him then, even when it did not make sense, even when it cost time they did not think they had. He had learned something that day he never forgot. Dogs like Rex did not guess. They knew. The thought lingered as Ethan straightened slightly and reached out, running his fingers along the wood paneling. The surface felt rough, splintered in spots, but there was a section, about shoulder height, that felt different, smoother, as though it had been sanded down more recently than the rest. He paused there, hands still, eyes narrowing as he traced the edges of that difference. "Someone worked on this," he said quietly, more statement than question. The words seemed to settle into the room and disappear. Rex's tail gave a single, slow movement, not a wag, more like a confirmation. Ethan pressed his palm flat against the spot and leaned in, listening. At first, nothing. Just his own breathing, steady but louder than he wanted it to be. Then, faintly, beneath the wood, something else. Not a voice, not even a clear sound. Just a hollow space, a subtle shift in the way silence echoed back to him, like the wall was thinner there, or not quite what it appeared to be. He pulled his hand back and glanced around the room, searching for anything that might explain it, any tool, any mark, any sign that this place had been more than abandoned. His eyes caught on the floor near the wall, where the dust had settled unevenly, disturbed in a narrow line that ran parallel to the paneling. It was faint, almost nothing, but it was there. Rex followed his gaze and then looked back at the wall, his body still, intent, as though waiting for Ethan to understand. "You are telling me something," Ethan said under his breath, a quiet acknowledgement more than anything else. He stepped closer again this time with purpose, his fingers finding the edge where two panels met. There was the slightest gap, barely visible unless you were looking for it. He pressed against it gently. Nothing moved. He applied a bit more pressure, testing, careful, patient. The wood gave a fraction of an inch, then stopped, as if resisting, as if it had been meant to stay closed. Ethan froze, his hand still against the panel, his heartbeat suddenly louder in his ears. The cabin around him seemed to lean inward again, the air tightening, listening. Rex did not move. He did not need to. Because in that moment, Ethan understood something simple and undeniable. This was not an old house making noise. This was something that had been hidden. And for the first time since he stepped inside, he felt it clearly. Not fear, not exactly, but a quiet certainty that whatever was behind that wall had been waiting longer than he had been alive to be found. The panel shifted again under his hand, just enough to confirm it was real, not imagination, not fatigue, not the lingering ghosts of places he had tried to leave behind. Ethan did not force it. He had learned that lesson the hard way, long ago. Some things did not open because you pushed harder. Some things opened when you understood how they were meant to be found. He let his hand rest there, fingers spread against the wood, feeling for anything that did not belong. The grain changed slightly near the edge, smoother, interrupted, like a scar that had healed over but never quite blended in. Rex stayed close, his body angled toward the wall, head tilted just a few degrees as if listening to something Ethan still could not hear. Easy, Ethan murmured, more to himself than the dog. His voice stayed low, controlled, the same tone he used when the world around him felt unpredictable. He slid his fingers along the seam again, slower this time, tracing it from top to bottom until he felt a small indentation, no larger than the tip of his thumb. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you were searching for it. He paused there, breath held without realizing it, then pressed gently. For a moment, nothing happened. Then there was a soft internal click, so faint it could have been mistaken for the settling of old wood, but it was too precise, too deliberate. Rex's ears snapped forward. Ethan felt it in his chest before he heard it again, that hollow shift, like something inside the wall had just been released from a long sleep. The panel loosened, not swinging open, just easing outward a fraction of an inch, enough to break the illusion that it had ever been solid. Ethan pulled his hand back slowly, giving the space a second, as if expecting it to respond on its own. It did not. The cabin remained still, the air thick and watchful. He reached forward again and gripped the edge of the panel, this time with intention, and drew it toward him. The wood resisted for a heartbeat, then gave way with a low, dragging sound, revealing a narrow opening behind it. Darkness waited on the other side, deeper than the shadows in the room, as if the light itself refused to enter. A faint breath of colder air slipped through the gap, carrying that same metallic trace, sharper now, mixed with something else, something older, like paper that had not been touched in years. Rex stepped forward immediately, stopping just short of the opening, his body still, his focus absolute. He did not try to enter. He did not need to. Ethan crouched beside him again, peering into the space. It was not a full room, not at first glance, more like a concealed compartment carved into the structure, just wide enough for a person to reach inside, but deep enough that the back wall disappeared into darkness. Someone did not want this found, Ethan said quietly, the realization settling in his voice without drama, without surprise, just a calm acceptance of what was becoming clear. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small flashlight, the metal casing worn from years of use. He hesitated for half a second before switching it on, the beam cutting clean through the darkness, revealing edges, shapes, outlines that had been hidden seconds before. The light fell on wood first, the interior framing of the wall, then deeper, catching on something that did not belong to the structure. A box, rectangular, set carefully against the back, not tossed, not forgotten, but placed with intention. It was not large, maybe 18 inches across, made of dark metal dulled by time, its surface etched with faint markings that the light could not fully reveal from this angle. There was no dust on it. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. Everything else in the cabin carried the weight of years, but this object sat clean, as if time had chosen to leave it alone. Rex let out a low, steady breath, not a growl, not a warning, just a sound that carried awareness. Ethan felt it too, not fear, not danger in the way he used to define it, but something quieter, heavier. Importance. He leaned in slightly, bringing the light closer, the beam steady despite the tension in his hand. The markings on the box came into focus, not words, not exactly, but symbols, deliberate, precise, etched by someone who wanted them to be seen by the right eyes and ignored by everyone else. Ethan did not recognize them, but he understood what they meant in a different way. This was not random. This was not accidental. This was something that had been hidden carefully, patiently, waiting for the moment someone would finally look in the right place. He shifted his weight, one knee pressing into the floor, and reached toward the box, stopping just short of touching it. Rex remained at his side, unmoving, his presence steady, grounding. For a long second, Ethan simply looked at it, the quiet between his thoughts stretching wider than the space in front of him. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "You did not find this by accident, did you?" Rex did not answer, but he did not need to. Because in that stillness, with the cold air slipping from the hidden space and the beam of light resting on something no one else had dared to see, Ethan understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was not the end of the mystery. This was where it began. The box did not move when his fingers finally touched it, but something inside him did, a subtle shift, like a memory trying to surface but stopping just short of clarity. The metal felt colder than the air around it, unnaturally so, as if it had not been touched by warmth in a very long time. Ethan did not rush. He let his hand rest there, palm flat against the surface, grounding himself in the simple reality of contact, weight, texture. Rex remained beside him, close enough that Ethan could feel the steady presence of him without looking, a quiet anchor in a place that seemed determined to pull him inward. The flashlight beam trembled slightly as Ethan adjusted his grip, angling the light across the top of the box again, studying the markings more carefully this time. They were not random scratches. Each line had intention, precision, carved with care and purpose. Some curved, some intersected, forming patterns that suggested meaning even if he could not read it. He had seen things like this before, not here, not in a cabin hidden deep in Oregon woods, but in places where people hid things they did not want found by accident. He swallowed slowly, the dryness in his throat catching him off guard. "Someone wanted this sealed," he said quietly, the words settling heavier than he expected. Rex shifted slightly, his nose lowering toward the edge of the opening, drawing in a slow breath, then another. His body did not tense. It aligned, focused. Ethan had learned to trust that difference. He slid his fingers along the side of the box, searching for a latch, a seam, anything that would suggest how it opened. There was no handle, no visible lock, just smooth metal interrupted only by those etched symbols. "Of course," he muttered under his breath, a faint trace of something almost like dry humor slipping through. Nothing about this was meant to be easy. He leaned closer, bringing the light down along the front edge. That was when he saw it. A thin line, barely noticeable, running horizontally across the face of the box. A separation point. A lid, but still no obvious way to lift it. Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think, not react. The cabin behind him remained silent, but it was no longer the empty silence of abandonment. It felt occupied now, not by something watching, but by something remembered. He could feel it in the stillness, the way the air seemed to hold its shape, as if even the walls knew what rested behind them. Rex let out a soft breath, then lowered his head slightly, his nose brushing just above the line Ethan had found. He paused there, then tapped the surface once, light but deliberate. Ethan's eyes followed the movement. "You are seeing something I am not," he murmured, the admission quiet but real. He adjusted the flashlight again, angling it lower, closer to where Rex had indicated. The light revealed a small indentation, almost perfectly aligned with the seam, no larger than the tip of a finger. Not carved, pressed, hidden in plain sight. Ethan stared at it for a moment, his heartbeat picking up just enough for him to notice. This was not random. This was designed. He hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for what he did not yet understand. Then, slowly, he pressed his thumb into the indentation. For a second, nothing happened. Then there was a soft, internal shift, a mechanism engaging somewhere inside the box, followed by a low, controlled release. The lid lifted a fraction of an inch on its own, just enough to break the seal. Ethan froze, his hand still against the metal, listening. No sound followed. No movement. Just that same steady, waiting silence. Rex did not move forward. He stayed exactly where he was, his presence firm, unwavering, as if this part was meant for Ethan alone. Ethan drew in a breath and let it out slowly, then slid his fingers beneath the edge of the lid and lifted it the rest of the way. The hinges moved smoothly, too smoothly for something that had been hidden this long. Inside, the darkness shifted again, replaced by the pale beam of his flashlight revealing what lay within. Not gold. Not anything that glittered or called attention to itself. Instead, a stack of documents, carefully bound, their edges yellowed with time, but preserved. Beneath them, a small velvet pouch, deep blue, untouched by dust. And resting on top, placed with deliberate care, a single metal tag attached to a thin chain. It caught the light just enough to reveal its shape, familiar in a way that tightened something deep in Ethan's chest before he even fully processed it. Rex's ears lifted slightly, his gaze fixed not on the papers, not on the pouch, but on that tag. Ethan reached for it slowly, his fingers closing around the cool metal, lifting it just enough to bring it into the light. The engraved surface reflected back at him, and for a moment, the world narrowed to that small piece of metal and the weight it carried. He did not speak. He did not need to, because something about this was no longer distant, no longer someone else's story hidden behind a wall. It was closer now, too close. And in that quiet, with the cabin holding its breath around him and Rex standing steady at his side, Ethan understood that whatever had been buried here was not just a secret. It was a message, and somehow it had found him. The metal tag felt heavier than it should have, as if its weight had nothing to do with the material and everything to do with what it carried. Ethan turned it slowly between his fingers, the chain brushing lightly against his knuckles, the faint sound barely audible in the stillness. The engraving caught the beam of the flashlight again, clearer this time, each letter pressed deep with intention. A name, a number, a unit designation, familiar in a way that did not feel like coincidence. Ethan's breath slowed, but his chest tightened, a quiet pressure building behind his ribs as recognition edged closer. He did not say the name out loud. Not yet. Rex shifted slightly beside him, his gaze steady, not questioning, not confused, just present. Ethan lowered himself onto one knee without thinking, the old floor creaking beneath him as he brought the tag closer to the light. His thumb traced the edges of the letters, the grooves worn just enough to suggest it had been handled before, long before it ended up here. This was not left behind, he said softly, the words settling into the air like something that had been waiting to be spoken. It was placed. Rex's ears flicked once, then settled again, his attention never leaving Ethan, as if whatever connection had just formed did not need explanation. Ethan exhaled slowly and set the tag gently against his palm, then reached for the stack of documents beneath it. The paper felt fragile but intact, bound together with a thin cord that had been tied with care, not haste. He loosened it carefully, mindful of the way time had preserved it, then lifted the first page into the light. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clear, typed in a formal structure that immediately pulled him into a different time, a different place. Dates, locations, names that carried weight even without context. He scanned the first lines quickly, then slowed, his eyes narrowing as something in the phrasing struck him as familiar. Not the words themselves, but the rhythm of them. The way reports were written. The way truth was documented without ever fully revealing itself. Rex stepped closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Ethan's arm, grounding him in the present as the past began to unfold in his hands. Ethan turned the page. Then another. Each line added something. Not answers, not yet, but direction. There were references to operations, to movements, to something that had been observed but never fully acknowledged. And then, a name appeared again. The same one etched into the metal tag. This time, in context. Attached to a report. Attached to a disappearance that had been recorded but not explained. Ethan stopped reading. The cabin seemed smaller suddenly, the walls closer, the air tighter, as if the space itself recognized the shift in him. He lowered the papers slightly, staring at them without seeing for a moment, his mind pulling threads together faster than he could follow. This is not just someone's past, he said, his voice quieter now, steadier in a way that came from something deeper than calm. This was buried on purpose. Rex let out a slow breath, his body relaxing just enough to signal understanding, not of the details, but of the weight. Ethan placed the documents carefully on the floor beside him and reached for the velvet pouch next. The fabric was soft, untouched by the decay around it, as if it had been protected intentionally. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the shape of something inside, small, solid. For a second, he hesitated, not out of fear, out of respect for the pattern forming in front of him. Then he loosened the drawstring and opened it. A ring slid into his palm. Simple, worn, not valuable in the way most people would measure it, but marked by time in a way that made it matter. There was an inscription on the inside, faint but legible under the beam of light. A date, and beneath it, 2 initials. Ethan stared at it, the pieces aligning in a way that felt inevitable now. The tag, the documents, the ring. This was not random. This was a life. Not just hidden, but preserved, protected. And for a moment, Ethan felt something he had not allowed himself in a long time. Not hope, not yet, but purpose. Rex shifted again, sitting down beside him this time, close enough that their shoulders touched, his warmth steady. Against the cold creeping through the cabin. Ethan closed his hand gently around the ring, then looked back at the open compartment, at the space where all of this had waited in silence for years. You brought me here, he said quietly, glancing at Rex. The dog did not react, did not need to. Because in that quiet, with the night pressing in from outside and the truth slowly rising from what had been hidden, Ethan understood something with absolute clarity. He had not come here to disappear. He had come here to uncover something that was never meant to stay buried. The ring rested in his palm longer than he expected, its edges pressing faintly into his skin as if it wanted to leave a mark, something permanent, something that would not fade when he closed his hand. Ethan did not rush to put it away. He let it sit there, turning it slowly between his fingers, the faint scratch of metal against callous skin grounding him in the present, while everything else seemed to pull backward into a story he had not lived but was somehow stepping into. The initials inside the band stayed with him, repeating in his mind without sound, forming a connection that was not yet complete but already undeniable. Rex leaned slightly closer, his head lowering just enough that his nose brushed against Ethan's wrist for a brief second, not interrupting, not demanding attention, just reminding him that he was not alone in this moment. Ethan exhaled and slipped the ring gently into his jacket pocket, then reached for the documents again, this time with a steadier hand. The pages felt less like artifacts now and more like pieces of something that had direction, something that had been waiting not just to be found, but to be understood. He spread them out carefully across the uneven floor, using the flashlight to scan each line with more focus than before. The dates stretched across years, not days or weeks, suggesting something that had unfolded slowly, deliberately, hidden in plain sight behind ordinary records. There were references to transfers, to locations that shifted from one state to another, then back again, always circling, always returning to something unnamed. Ethan followed the pattern with his finger, tracing the path as if it might reveal itself more clearly through motion. You kept coming back here, he said under his breath, the realization forming as the pattern repeated. Or someone made sure you did. Rex remained still, his gaze alternating between the papers and the open compartment, as if both held equal importance. Ethan turned another page, then paused. This one was different. Handwritten. The ink darker, the lines less controlled, as if written under pressure or in haste, but still legible. He leaned closer, bringing the light down until the words sharpened into focus. It was not a report. It was a note. Short, direct, not meant for record, but for whoever might find it. Ethan read it once, then again, slower the second time, each word settling deeper than the last. There was no panic in it, no fear, just clarity. A statement that something had been hidden because it had to be, not because it should have been forgotten. And a single line at the bottom that changed everything. A location. Not this cabin. Somewhere else. Close, but not here. Ethan felt his chest tighten again, not from confusion, but from the sense that the story in his hands was expanding beyond the walls around him. This was never the end point, he said quietly, more certain now. This was just the first place. Rex's ears lifted slightly, his body shifting forward a fraction as if acknowledging the change. Ethan folded the note carefully and set it aside, then gathered the rest of the documents into a neat stack, his movements more deliberate now, less uncertain. The pieces were beginning to align, not fully, not yet, but enough to show direction. He glanced back at the open compartment, at the empty space where the box had rested, and for the first time since opening it, he noticed something he had missed before. The interior was deeper than it appeared at first glance. The back wall did not sit flush. There was a slight recess, a shadow within a shadow, subtle but real. Ethan leaned forward, bringing the light closer, angling it carefully. The beam slid past the edge of the compartment and revealed a narrow gap, no more than a few inches, running vertically along the back. He reached out slowly, sliding his fingers into the space. The air inside was colder, still, untouched. His fingertips brushed against something smooth. Not wood, not metal, paper, thicker than the documents he had already found. He paused, then carefully pulled it free. It was a folded map. Not new, not printed recently. The paper was aged but intact, its creases sharp, as if it had been folded with precision and left that way intentionally. Ethan unfolded it slowly, the edges resisting at first, then easing open to reveal a layout that was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Roads, landmarks, a section of forest marked with a hand-drawn circle, darker than the rest of the lines. And next to it, written in the same handwriting as the note, a single word. Finish. Ethan stared at it, the meaning settling into place without explanation. This was not just a record of what had happened. This was a continuation, a path left behind for someone else to follow. Rex stepped closer again, his gaze fixed on the map now, his body aligned in a way Ethan recognized instantly. Ready. Not anxious. Not afraid. Just ready. Ethan folded the map carefully and held it in his hand for a moment, feeling its weight, its purpose, then looked around the cabin one more time. The shadows had not changed. The silence had not lifted. But something inside him had shifted in a way he could not ignore. You were not hiding, he said quietly, glancing down at the documents, then at the map. You were waiting. Rex's tail moved once, slow and certain. And in that quiet, with the truth stretching beyond the walls and the night pressing in from every side, Ethan understood something that settled deeper than fear ever could. This was not about what had been left behind. It was about what still needed to be found. The map stayed in his hand longer than anything else had, its edges pressing lightly into his palm, as if it carried a direction that could not be ignored once felt. Ethan stood slowly, his knees stiff from the cold floor, the weight of the cabin shifting around him as he rose. For a moment, he just listened again, the same way he had when he first stepped inside, but the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It felt resolved, like something that had been waiting had finally been acknowledged. Rex stood with him, his body already angled toward the door, not rushed, not impatient, just aligned with a purpose that had not been there before. Ethan glanced back at the open compartment one last time, the hidden space now exposed, its secret no longer buried but not yet complete. He moved forward and gently closed the metal box, placing the documents and the remaining contents back inside with care, leaving only the map and the tag with him. The panel slid back into place with a soft, final sound, the wall returning to what it had been before, but the difference now was permanent. Ethan picked up his duffel bag and slung it over his shoulder, the familiar motion steadying him in a way that nothing else could. We are not staying, he said quietly, more a confirmation than a decision. Rex stepped ahead of him, crossing the room without hesitation, his paws moving with quiet certainty across the uneven boards. The front door opened with the same low groan, but this time it did not sound like resistance. It sounded like release. The night air met them immediately, cooler than before, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, sharper now, clearer, as if the world outside had been waiting just as much as the space within. Ethan stepped off the porch and paused for a second, his eyes lifting toward the dark outline of the forest stretching beyond the clearing. The map in his hand felt heavier now, not with doubt, but with direction. He unfolded it again briefly, letting the flashlight trace the path marked in ink, the circle drawn with deliberate intent. It was not far, a few miles at most, deeper into the woods where the road would fade and the ground would take over. Close enough to reach before dawn if they moved steadily. Rex stood at the edge of the clearing, his head lifted, ears forward, not scanning randomly, but fixed on a direction that matched the map without needing to see it. Ethan watched him for a moment, a quiet understanding passing between them without words. You already know? he said under his breath. Rex did not look back. He simply took a step forward, then another, moving into the darkness with the same calm certainty he had carried inside the cabin. Ethan followed, his boots pressing into the soft earth as gravel gave way to soil, then to the faint outline of a path that was not marked but felt. The trees closed in slowly, their branches weaving. Overhead, filtering what little moonlight there was into thin, shifting patterns on the ground. The deeper they moved, the quieter it became, until even the wind seemed to fall away, leaving only the sound of their footsteps and the steady rhythm of breath. Ethan kept his eyes on Rex, trusting the way the dog navigated without hesitation, adjusting direction by instinct alone. The map remained folded in his hand now, no longer something he needed to read with every step. After a while, the terrain shifted slightly, the ground rising just enough to change the pace of his stride. Rocks pressed through the soil, roots twisting underfoot, the forest thickening in a way that felt older, less touched. Rex slowed, not stopping, but reducing his pace, his head lowering slightly as his focus sharpened. Ethan felt it too, that same subtle shift in the air, not danger, not exactly, but proximity. They were close. The path narrowed further until it was no longer a path at all, just a direction through trees that seemed to stand closer together than they should. Then Rex stopped. Not abruptly, deliberately. His body still, his gaze fixed ahead at something Ethan could not yet see. Ethan stepped up beside him, his breath steady but quieter now, his senses narrowing in the same way they had inside the cabin. The flashlight beam moved forward slowly, cutting through the darkness until it found it. A shape. Low. Weathered. Partially hidden by overgrowth. Not a cabin. Not a structure meant to be lived in. Something else. Something older. Something that had been waiting just as long as everything they had just left behind. Ethan lowered the light slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. So this is where it leads. Rex did not move. And for the first time since they left the road behind, Ethan felt it clearly. Not fear, not hesitation, but the quiet weight of what came next. Because whatever had been hidden in the cabin was only the beginning, and whatever stood in front of them now was the reason it had been hidden at all. The shape in front of them did not reveal itself all at once, and somehow that made it feel older, like something that had learned to exist without needing to be seen. Ethan stepped forward slowly, the beam of his flashlight steady but narrow, cutting through branches and shadow until the details began to separate from the darkness. It was a structure, but not one meant for comfort or shelter. The walls were low, built from stone stacked with deliberate care, each piece fitted tightly, as if meant to endure long after whoever placed them there was gone. Moss clung to the edges, creeping over the surface in soft green layers, and the roof, if it had ever been complete, had partially given way to time, leaving gaps where the night sky pressed through in silent witness. Rex moved first, closing the distance with measured steps, his posture alert but not tense, as if he recognized the place not as a threat, but as a destination. Ethan followed, his boots crunching lightly over dried leaves and scattered gravel, the sound oddly loud in a space that seemed to absorb everything else. The closer he got, the more the air shifted again, not colder this time, but heavier, as though the ground itself held something that had not been disturbed in years. He reached the edge of the structure and paused, letting the silence settle around him before stepping inside. The interior was small, no more than 10 feet across, enclosed on 3 sides with the 4th partially collapsed, opening it to the forest beyond. The floor was not dirt. It was stone, flat and arranged in a pattern that felt intentional, each slab placed with purpose rather than convenience. Ethan lowered the light, letting it move slowly across the ground until it stopped at the center. There was a marking there, faint but visible, carved directly into the stone. Not the same symbols from the box, but related, similar in their precision, in the way they suggested meaning beyond decoration. Rex stood just outside the circle of light, his gaze fixed on the center, his body still, as if waiting for something Ethan had yet to understand. Ethan stepped closer, the beam tightening over the carving, tracing its edges, following the lines until they began to form something familiar, not in shape, but in structure. Coordinates. Not exact, not written in numbers, but translated into a pattern that pointed somewhere specific. Somewhere else. Ethan's grip tightened slightly around the flashlight as he processed it, the realization forming piece by piece. The map had led them here, but this was not the end. This was another marker. Another step. He exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the faint chill that lingered just above the stone. You built a path, he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to break the silence without disturbing it. Not to hide, to guide. Rex shifted then, stepping forward into the light for the first time since they arrived, his paws moving carefully until he stood beside the marking. He lowered his head, sniffing once, then twice, then lifted his gaze toward the far edge of the structure where the collapsed wall opened into deeper forest. Ethan followed that line instinctively, the beam of light sweeping across the opening, catching on something just beyond the stone boundary. A post. Wooden, weathered but upright, driven into the ground with force that had not weakened over time. Ethan stepped toward it, each movement slower now, more deliberate, as if the space itself demanded respect. The post stood about 3 feet tall, its surface worn smooth by years of exposure, and at the top, attached with a single metal bracket, was another object. Smaller than the box. Simpler, but no less intentional. Ethan raised the light and felt something in his chest settle into place before he even reached it. It was another tag, not identical to the one in his pocket, but similar in form, the same kind of metal, the same weight carried in its presence. This one, however, was not meant to be taken. It was fixed, anchored to the post, as if marking something rather than belonging to someone. Ethan stopped a step away, his eyes moving over the engraving without touching it. A different name, a different number, but the same unit designation, the same pattern. His breath slowed again, deeper this time, as the understanding expanded beyond a single story, beyond a single person. This was not one life hidden away. This was many. A chain. A record that had never been written where it was supposed to be. Rex stood beside him, silent, steady, his presence grounding as the weight of it settled in. Ethan reached out slowly, not to take the tag, but to rest his fingers lightly against the wood of the post, feeling the grain beneath his hand, the quiet strength of something that had been placed with intention and left to stand. You did not want to be forgotten, he said, the words softer now, almost reverent. The forest did not answer. It did not need to, because in that moment, with the stone structure behind him, the carved marking beneath his feet, and the second tag fixed in place before him, Ethan understood the truth that had been hidden in pieces until now. This was not about fear, not about haunting. It was about memory, about names that had not been carried forward, about a story that had been left incomplete. Rex turned his head slightly, looking past the post, deeper into the trees where the darkness thickened once more. Ethan followed his gaze, the path ahead no longer marked by maps or carvings, but by something quieter, something that did not need to be written down to be understood. And for the first time since he arrived in Blackridge Hollow, he did not feel like a man running from something behind him. He felt like a man walking towards something that had been waiting all along. The forest did not grow darker as they moved forward, but it did grow quieter, the kind of quiet that settles into your bones and stays there long after the sound returns. Ethan took one step past the post, then another, his hand dropping from the weathered wood as if leaving something behind that did not belong to him. Rex moved ahead without hesitation, his pace steady, his path certain even without markers, as though whatever had guided them this far no longer needed symbols or signs. The ground beneath their feet softened, the stones giving way to layers of pine needles that muted each step until even their presence felt lighter, less intrusive. Ethan glanced back once, just once, at the small stone structure now fading into the darkness behind them. It did not feel abandoned anymore. It felt complete. He turned forward again and followed Rex deeper into the trees. They walked for what could have been minutes or hours, time stretching in that strange way it does when purpose replaces uncertainty. The forest began to thin gradually, the tight weave of trunks opening just enough to allow a faint gray light to bleed through the canopy. Dawn was coming. Not fully, not yet, but enough to change the shape of the shadows, enough to soften the edges of the world around them. Rex slowed as the ground leveled out, his head lifting slightly as the air shifted again, this time carrying something different. Not the scent of decay or damp wood, but something cleaner, lighter, like earth that had been turned and left to breathe. Ethan felt it too, that subtle change, and followed the dog into a small clearing that revealed itself without warning. It was not large, maybe 20 yards across, bordered by trees that stood at a respectful distance, as if they had chosen not to cross an invisible line. At the center of the clearing stood a single wooden marker, simpler than the post they had just left behind. No carvings, no metal attached, just a piece of wood, worn smooth by time and weather, standing quietly in the open. Ethan approached slowly, the light growing stronger with each step as dawn pushed further into the sky. The details came into focus one by one. A name carved into the surface, a date beneath it, and nothing else. No explanation, no story, just a name. Ethan stopped a few feet away, his breath steady, his shoulders relaxed in a way they had not been in a long time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tag he had taken from the box, the metal catching the first hint of morning light as he held it between his fingers. The engraving matched the name on the marker. Not similar. Exact. He stood there for a long moment, the connection settling into place without resistance, without doubt. This was where the path had been leading. Not to a hidden treasure. Not to something meant to be taken or claimed. But to a place meant to be remembered. Rex stepped forward and sat beside the marker, his posture calm, his gaze forward, not searching anymore, not listening for something unseen. Just present. Ethan lowered himself slowly to one knee, the ground cool beneath him, and placed the tag gently at the base of the marker, his hand lingering there for a second before letting go. The metal rested against the wood as if it had always belonged there, as if the distance between where it had been hidden and where it now lay had only ever been temporary. Ethan did not speak right away. He let the silence hold the moment. Let the quiet do what words could not. The sun crested the edge of the trees then, a thin line of gold breaking through the branches and stretching across the clearing until it touched the marker, the tag, and the space between them. The light did not feel dramatic. It felt right. Rex shifted slightly, leaning just enough that his shoulder brushed against Ethan's arm, a simple contact that carried more weight than anything else in that moment. Ethan reached out without looking and rested his hand against the dog's neck, fingers pressing gently into the thick fur, grounding himself in something warm, something alive. "You did not just find a secret," he said quietly, his voice steady, no longer searching. "You brought me to someone who needed to be remembered." Rex remained still, his presence unwavering, as if that had been the purpose all along. Ethan stood slowly, his hand falling back to his side, and took one last look at the marker, the tag, the quiet clearing now bathed in morning light. There was no fear here, no sense of something unfinished, only a calm that settled deep and stayed. He turned then, not away from it, but forward, the direction no longer uncertain, no longer heavy. Rex stood with him immediately, ready, not because there was something more to find, but because there was something to carry now. As they walked back toward the trees, the forest did not close in behind them. It opened, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan did not feel like he was leaving something behind. He felt like he was finally moving with it. Some stories do not end in answers. They end in understanding. And sometimes, that is enough to bring a man back to life.